In Luke 21:24, Jesus reveals they will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So number one, here Jesus is predicting Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed. Number two, he's predicting Jews would be killed and taken away as prisoners. Number three, he's predicting that the Jews would survive. Number four, he's predicting that non-Jews would control Jerusalem for a time. And then number five, he's predicting that at some point Jews would once again gain control. So let's talk about number one. Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed. I've had atheist opponents who have said that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple were an obvious, almost foredrawn conclusion. They claim that Rome was in the habit of destroying cities. On the contrary, Rome was an empire of builders. There were times when Rome destroyed cities, think of Carthage, but generally it was because that city represented another military power that challenged Rome's authority. By and large, Rome preferred to leave cities intact. There are obvious reasons for this. A destroyed city is a city stricken with poverty. If Rome could preserve a city and bring it under control, then taxes and tribute could be collected. Very little taxes came from burning heaps of rubble, as you can imagine. In fact, Titus, the commander of the Roman forces during the Jewish war, wanted to preserve the Jewish temple. He claimed that his army burned the temple against his wishes. So Jerusalem being destroyed and the temple was not a foredrawn conclusion. Number two, Jesus predicted that Jews would be killed and taken away as prisoners. In a similar manner, I've had atheists claim that Rome was in the habit of banishing and exiling people from the lands that they were conquered. This is wrong on two counts. Rome was in the habit of killing rebels, taking prisoners, selling slaves, but they didn't often exile people groups. In the various Jewish wars and revolts, Rome killed hundreds of thousands of Jews at the destruction of the nation. Many more died of hunger. Titus took some Jewish prisoners to Rome and sold some Jews as slaves in Libya. However, Josephus, who is our best source on the subject, doesn't say anything about exile or banishment. Centuries later, there were bans on Jews entering the city of Jerusalem, but even still, there have been small numbers of Jews living in Jerusalem for the last 3,300 years. This matters because Jerusalem is its people. Rome renamed the city Capitolonia after its destruction, and it became a pagan city. However, the small number of Jews that remained were trampled by Gentiles for nearly 2,000 years. Number three, Jesus predicted the Jews would survive. I've had atheist opponents who claim that this is not all that surprising. However, think about this. Virtually all ancient ethnicities disappear by way of assimilation. Where are the Etruscans, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, even the Romans no longer exist? They all have been assimilated into whatever culture was around them. Generally, this happens when their homeland disappears. When a people group no longer has a homeland or a region to occupy, they get assimilated. It's happened thousands of times throughout history. Homeless people groups don't retain their distinctiveness, but eventually they disappear. That is true of virtually all ancient ethnicities except the Jews. Now add on top of that the fact that the Jews have been expelled from virtually every country they have taken up residence in. They have been persecuted everywhere they've gone. The Jews are the only people to have a distinct word for the mistreatment that they've experienced, anti-Semitism. They have remained around a population of 1 million for 1,600 years. Hitler killed 6 million of them, which was a big percentage of their population at the time. The only way most persecuted people survive is by having a large enough population to absorb the destruction. The Jews have been small in number for most of their existence, and yet they have still survived. They've had attempts at genocide, and yet they survived. So, nonetheless, all of these things, Jesus predicted it, and it's come true. Number four, non-Jews would control Jerusalem for a time. This is exactly what happened. Jerusalem was controlled by Gentile rulers for 1,887 years. So Jerusalem was trampled by the Gentiles. Romans, Byzantine, Persian, Arab, Crusaders, Mamluk, Ottoman, and the British rulers all controlled the land at various times. And number five, Jesus predicted that at some point Jews would once again gain control of Jerusalem. He said, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, so basically he's saying, at the point when Jerusalem is no longer controlled by Gentiles, the time of the Gentiles is over. Now that seems a little redundant, but there's something important in it. It predicts a few things. It predicts that the Jews would regain some national cohesion. It predicts that they would grow in military power enough to retake the city. This was considered an impossible task. How could Jews ever retake Jerusalem without a military to do it? How could Jews have a military if they didn't have a homeland? How could Jews have a nation if they didn't have Jerusalem? For many years, this verse was viewed as possibly allegorical or was somehow going to be fulfilled when Jesus returned. However, in 1948, the nation of Israel was reestablished. However, the nation boundaries didn't include most of Jerusalem. For a number of years, Israel grew. In 1967, Israel took back Jerusalem from the Gentiles. If you haven't read accounts of the Six-Day War, you should. Many who fought in it described the happenings as unexplained and even miraculous. Whatever the case may be, Jesus predicted that it would happen, and it happened. Take note that none of these things are vague, and they describe very unlikely events. Nonetheless, Jesus predicted it, and it came true.